of LHM last year, and it went really well. And now this year, we're excited to really kind of be expanding on that and getting to really reflect on our heritage and our culture, and really getting to kind of address also the disparities that are there in the healthcare field. As far as just reminder to keep your mics off if you're not talking, and to kind of go off of that. At the end of the talk, we're going to be opening the floor to questions. Those can be submitted via the chat feature, and I can read them from there. And so with that, I'll go ahead and pass it off to Dr. Ellen Cosgrove.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's really a great privilege and pleasure for me to introduce our inaugural Latinx Grand Rounds Speaker, Dr. David Acosta. It is no exaggeration to say that Dr. Acosta, starting 20 years ago, was one of the people who shaped the vision for equity, diversity, and inclusion as a model for excellence. At the time, the debate in academic medicine was often, well, do we want to achieve excellence or do we want to achieve diversity? And Dr. Acosta was literally one of the people who reframed that conversation, forced academic medicine to take a hard look at the data that were emerging from industry examples that showed that the only path to excellence is through diversity and inclusion across all spheres. Dr. Acosta has, in that way, completely reframed the conversation, and I look forward to the next place that he will lead us. So without further ado, Dr. Acosta.
Thanks, Ellen, and thank you, Aaron, for this opportunity, and thank you for that gracious invitation and introduction, Ellen. It's good to see you again, and good to be back at Albany Medical College. And I want to say hello to everybody, and welcome to this Grand Rounds. First, I want to start off by saying my pronouns are he, him, and his. And I also want to, as the Hispanic Heritage Month celebration, again, I want to also say that I'm a second-generation Latino, and I think about my ancestors that I follow today as I talk with you about equity, about this piece. Also, before I get started, I think it's apropos to also recognize and acknowledge that we are all guests and respect the traditional territory and the homelands of the Mohican and the Haudenosaunee Confederation people, both past and present, before we get started today, too, as well. And so today what I'd like to do is, again, with the travels through diversity and inclusion, I think we're at a third dimension that I'm going to talk about today. And it's not just health equity. It's about becoming equity advancing institutions and really kind of covering and talking about what does that really mean? How can we basically learn from others as we move forward? And I'll explain that a little bit more. So today what I want to do is, as I speak with you today, I'm really asking you to reflect and examine the institutional landscape, which basically means I'd like you to think about your lived experience at Albany Medical College. Whether you're a staff member, whether you're a learner, a faculty member, or even part of the community that you're experiencing Albany Medical College, what's really important about your lived experience is because you shape the learning in the workplace environment. And the important piece about that is that shapes the culture and the climate that we all experience at the same time. And this is really about shaping the climate about how we look at others, how we treat others, how we ask questions, how we make decisions, but even to the point of how we treat our patients as well. And through that, what I want to do is explore today with you the practice of conscious inclusion. And if so many of you already know what that is, then ultimately this validates what you hopefully already know. But I want to talk about really its demonstrated benefits and its intimate connection with diversity and what does it have to do with excellence. But I also want to explore the concept of equity-mindedness and its implications on how academic medical institutions can really achieve equity advancement through inclusion, excellence, and diversity. And then lastly, what I hope to do with you today is to go ahead and talk a little bit about, what are we doing at the AAMC to assist medical institutions in reaching excellence through the lens of diversity, inclusion, and equity as well. So I'd be remiss if I didn't celebrate, again, some of the accomplishments that we've had today with our Latino community sorts of things. But I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention what's been going on over the last 3 to 4 years in our country. There's been so many challenges on our campuses and our hospitals and our society that we've been facing over these last several years that has been so overwhelming. And as I go around and I visit other campuses as well, it certainly has created a lot of anxiety and a lot of expressed concerns for our administrative teams, for our offices of diversity across the country, for our learners and the staff. And there's just a lot of tension that many are experiencing both directly and indirectly. In some of the pictures that you see depicted, some of us are indirectly impacted by this as it has impacted friends of us, our colleagues, or even family members that have been, again, persecuted through some of the events that have happened over these last several years as well. This is just also a reminder about who we are as an academic institution. We have to remember that our institutions are a microcosm of society. The walls that we work under basically don't hide out and keep out what's going on within society. And especially over the last several years, and ignited again by the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, and others, many others that we have known over the last several years, again, has ignited, our voices and ignited a movement that to really call attention to the structural racism that we're all experiencing, that we know have been around for centuries. This is nothing new, but the voice is new. The louder the voice is and the paying attention of it becomes very critical to us. But again, I think the political and social challenges has really divided the country, as we all know as well. Even the sentiments towards Latinos and anyone who speaks Spanish in America, to the anti-immigrant sentiment, the anti-Semitism, anti-LGBT, and others that have been marginalized population groups that we're very well aware of as well. And again, as I think about the COVID-19 pandemic, some have said now we're facing two pandemics, not only just racism, but also COVID-19, that essentially has reminded us of how systemic racism has contributed to creating some of the health inequities that we are seeing suffered by most of our most vulnerable population groups as well. And rather than just concentrating on celebrating and looking at all the contributions that Latinos have contributed, again, this slide has lots and lots of data on it, just as a reminder of the health inequities suffered most by our vulnerable communities during this pandemic, and especially homeless, those incarcerated, individuals with disabilities, marginalized communities, LGBTQ+, as well as those in poverty, and especially racial and ethnic communities, African American populations, American Indian and Hispanic populations in the United States. Certainly the pandemic has unearthed these inequities that have been in our healthcare system, again, for many, many years, and now it's time for us to address it. When you start looking at the data that's covered on this slide, there's no question about how the Latinos are basically being impacted by COVID-19, representing over 60 million people in the United States, or 18% of the total U.S. population. More than a third of the cases overall of COVID cases are suffered from the Latino communities as well. The picture also depicts that geographic variances are there, but it's pretty remarkable when you start looking at different samplings across the United States. When you look at the total population of a state of Latinos, the large amount of cases of Latinos that are suffering from COVID-19 that it impacts. Latinos are also hospitalized at a much higher rate than whites, 4.7 times as that, and 26% of the people who die from COVID-19 are Latino as well. It's no different in the state of New York, and if you see the graphic underneath the picture there, it also depicts in green and also depicts in blue, kind of a grayish blue sort of thing. The amount of deaths that are in people of color, African Americans represented by the green again, and blue by our Latinos as well. So those inequities don't stop there. And my talk mainly is really to kind of really focus on some of the inequities that are within our own academic medicine institution as well. More and more studies are being revealed that tell us on the stories that we hear from our learners, our faculty, and our staff are really revealing structural inequities that are very much alive in our educational institutions that impact all our learners, our faculty, and our staff. In fact, as the quote from Catherine Peltier Campbell say, the legacy of exclusion in higher education is even becoming more difficult to ignore given the country's growing diversity, but also the heartbreaking scenes that I've already showed you already. We have institutional policies, structures, expectations, and unspoken rules that have perpetuated a double and sometimes in some folks triple standard, both in the learning and workplace environments for specific population groups. And I think what we need to do is really take, we are now called to action to take a real harder look and ask ourselves, what are some of those exclusionary practices that we haven't noticed before that we should be noticing now that we're demonstrating on a daily basis? Again, and this has also been demonstrated in our literature. There's a dearth of literature that basically has talked about the challenges that have been faced by our medical students and residents that come from historically excluded and underrepresented groups in STEM. Again, some of them are highlighted, but I put them in bold specifically because we always and only talk sometimes only about a lack of exposure to minority faculty, the lack of minority faculty role models. But the reality is that there's a sense that we have to assimilate to the culture of academic medicine, or else we'll be looked upon as being very different and not fitting in. The amount of mistreatment, chronic macroaggressions that have been reported, are now coming out stronger and stronger, not only in medical students and residents, but the lived experiences from our faculty as well. Racial bias, prejudice, and discrimination is very much alive on all of our campuses. And again, the things that I think as a repercussion of that, the stereotypes that still plagues our medical students and residents, no matter how much they have accomplished, again, because they're held to this double standard, ultimately still suffer from the imposter syndrome and the stereotype threat, which leads, unfortunately, to isolation and marginalization. And the unfortunate part about this is that we have not dealt with this from a systemic standpoint. We need to basically, in order to deal with this, we need to really look at our systemic infrastructure, the policies and the practices that are perpetuated a lot of these challenges. How can we experts to provide culturally competent patient care when they themselves are challenged and are victims of biases, prejudice, discrimination, mistreatment, and daily microaggressions? I think we have an obligation to better call attention to this as well. And at the same time, call attention to help our faculty as well and provide faculty development so they can actually understand and recognize some of the manifestations of some of these elements that we're talking about and what they can do as faculty to help improve this as well. This is from a blog from Julie Shane, who's a faculty member at the University of Washington in Washington State. And she talks about emotional labor. And I bring this up because, again, as I think back to my times, even as a diversity dean, these are unprecedented times, and I can't ever remember the impact that emotional labor is having upon our faculty. Emotional labor is about supporting students, but I would also add for those mid-career and senior career faculty members of color as they also are there to support our early career faculty and staff. It's the emotional labor of supporting the students and staff and faculty as they experience alienation, marginalization, and trauma within the institution, which prevent them from working to their full potential. And you know who these people are. These are the people that ultimately have an open door policy for everybody. They'll draft their grant making, they'll draft their manuscript in order to take the time to listen. Because there's this innate, compassionate obligation to give back to students, to give back to staff and to faculty members that had the same lived experience that they had when they were going in their journey as well. And they serve as what I call the canary in the mine. Now, for those of you that may not remember this metaphor, in the old days before we had the technology, miners used to take cages with small birds inside of them to go into the mine caves they have in order to pick out the toxic fumes that would be very dangerous to the workers. The birds themselves would basically collapse if they had a certain toxic level, which gave about 10 to 15 minutes for the workers to get out of the particular mine. And so I look at those who perform emotional labors as kind of the canaries in the mines, because through their listening, we hear our institutions are failing to meet the needs of our minoritized and our traumatized students, staff as well. And unfortunately, what we also find is, again, we've heard a lot about minority tax, that many of these folks, again, do come from 100% minority backgrounds, and they're the ones that are putting most of the work, but yet don't get much benefit, don't get much reward from it or are recognized for that. And students remind us that if you go upstream, minority students as well who are involved in this work, I think about the wonderful work being done by the USA Alliance, again, are also have to put in some emotional labor for other students that they continue to mentor. We have data that basically talks about the mistreatment that within that they're experiencing. This is just a sampling of the graduate questionnaire from 2019 that the AAMC puts out, that has all their medical students fill out after their experiences, and usually spring before they graduate. And question number 42 asks a really important question. It asks, personally, have you experienced mistreatment or harassment? And this really excludes public embarrassment. 40% of our graduating students, or over 15,000 students, say, yes, I have personally had my own experience in experiencing, not just seeing, but experiencing mistreatment and harassment. When we look at the data, saying, well, so what have schools done? We've done a lot of work in trying to increase awareness of policies and procedures. And if you look from 2014 to 2019, again, I think schools have done a really good job. But here's the problem. If you look at question number 45, the question was asked of those who said yes, and saying, so if you had this, did you report any of these behaviors? Only 23% said yes, meaning the rest decided that they didn't report this as well. And that hasn't really changed that much. It's rising a little bit since 2014. But when asked, why didn't you report any of these incidences or these behaviors? And in 2019, 39% of the graduating fourth-year students said, because I didn't think anything would be done about it. 30% of them said it's because I was fearful of reprisal if I would just say anything as well, and I'm too close to graduating. So this, folks, the reason I bring this up is for a real simple reason. This is about culture, and this is about climate within our academic institutions, and this is just a national report. This is why I urge you to look at the data of your own school to kind of see how you're performing. But again, medical students aren't alone. There's even reports from residents as well. This is just a study, a comprehensive study that was done by Finesse and colleagues. They did a systematic review of the literature, and they found 59 studies that included looking at the prevalence and the harassment of discrimination among medical students and residents. And overall, what you'll find is that 63.4% of residents cited that, yes, they personally also were harassed or discriminated against. All the other numbers below basically disaggregate that into different, looking at gender discrimination being one of the highest at 66% that they experienced it, even sexual harassment, egregious sexual harassment at 36%, racial discrimination at 26% there. And our faculty, as I mentioned, aren't alone from this. They also have faced these many, many challenges. When the words that you see in italics are real similar, I italicize them only to highlight that these sorts of things that are highlighted for medical students and residents don't go away. They persist in our faculty as well. But there's a couple of other things that come out that, again, this is part of just awareness about what faculty are telling us about what their lived experiences is. There's maybe new phrases here that I'll run through really quickly. Code switching, for example. Many of our minority faculty don't feel that they can be authentic to who they truly are. They can't live out all of their multiple identities. And they feel very vulnerable for not fitting in, because what they're expected to do is to conform to the major dominant group at their particular institution. This leaves them to feeling more vulnerable for not fitting in and not free to be authentic to who they really are. We talked a little bit about minority tax. Racial battle fatigue was coined by Dr. William Smith out of the University of Utah as he was studying many of the veterans that came back from Iraq and Afghanistan, was comparing and looking at manifestations that he was studying from battle fatigue. But at his university, as he started working with his faculty, started noticing that a lot of the clinical manifestations that our faculty were facing was very similar to what he found in the veterans of battle fatigue. This whole notion that faculty perceive their environment as being extremely stressful, exhausting, and diminishing to their sense of control, their meaning, and their comfort, to the point that it led to clinical manifestations of the feelings of loss, ambiguity, helplessness, and hopelessness. The Mason Report, the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, also published a report several summers ago on the high incidence of sexual and gender harassment in academia. And it's just a reminder that, again, in our environments, in our academic setting, that more than 50% of female faculty and staff in academia, and between 20 to 50% of female students in science, engineering, and medicine said that they experience sexual awareness. You know, given these challenges, I think every program will have to take a much more closer look at their learning and workplace environment. We have to, now with this data that's presented before us. And the question really is, are we prepared, and do we have the capacity and the skill sets in order to identify, recognize, and provide the necessary assistance and resources if these challenges are encountered, you know, to help our learners, our faculty, you know, deem well. Why is this important? Because the other data you have is this. Now, as we go upstream for the impact of this, we find that medical students and residents report poor emotional and mental health outcomes. This includes an increase in substance abuse, a decrease in their self-confidence and self-esteem, which impacts their academic performance. Also, signs of mental health illnesses such as depression, suicidal ideation, and new reports that are coming out of these increases of suicide. Post-traumatic stress disorder now has started to rear its ugly head as well. And then not only do physicians experience burnout, burnout starts very early on, you know, with our medical students and our residents. We found in the Mason reports that among the most telling statistics that they found is that more than 50% of U.S. physicians report significant symptoms of burnout. 39% of our physicians claim that they, 39% of our physicians have depression, and there's over 400 suicides per year, you know, that our physicians commit. Unfortunately, in healthcare, what we find is that burnout is nearly twice as much as any other U.S. workforce, even when you control for hours worked and other factors related to that as well. And the data goes on with Shanafelt and Noseworthy are very well known for their work on the impact of physician burnout. On the left-hand side of your picture, you see the broken marriages, substance abuse, as I already mentioned, depression, and suicide in physicians, much like we talked about with medical students as well. But we also found the impact from a professional level, that as burnout starts to happen, we start seeing the decreased quality of care that is provided to our patients, the increased medical errors that occurs, the decrease in patient satisfaction, and decreased productivity and professional effort by them as well, and unfortunately then leads to more higher physician turnover. This is a recent study that came out from our group. Valerie Dander and colleagues at the AAMC began looking at the sampling, looked at over 13 samples of institutions of over 7,650 faculty that responded to this particular survey between 2016 and 2018. And overall, what they found is that 29% of all faculty are burning out or they're burned out. Just to orientate you to the screen is what you'll see in the red here are those that are burnt out, the orange, the mahogany, those that are burning out, and the yellow depicts those that are under stress. Green depicts that they're really enjoying their work. But one of the things that you'll see from this graph as you look at it pretty closely is that, you know, there's not one type of medical student faculty that is separated from others who's experiencing burnout. All types of medical school faculty, whether you're basic science faculty or clinical faculty, are experiencing burnout, and we need to begin paying attention to that because, as the Mason report says, it's really the institutional culture and climate that we really need to think about. You know, what toxicity is happening in our particular environments that we need to pay attention to as well. The findings also show that 35% of URM women faculty are reporting burnout versus 21% of URM men faculty, and 35% of non-URM women faculty are reporting burnout versus 26% of that as well. And then lastly, what they found, again, on those that have self-reported burnout in our faculty, increases among our faculty, we find that they become less and less satisfied with their department, and their intention to leave begins to increase as well. And this has been elected, and they only elect to stay only for 2 years. So the implications for all this, again, part of it is trying to set the stage and the framework and an understanding and appreciation that I strongly believe that we need to have. Spend a lot more time taking pause and taking a deeper focus on our learning and workplace environment. Again, when I start thinking about structural racism, what is happening today, again, I think about the call from our students, the call from our residents and other faculty members. We need to stop, pay attention, and this time really do a deeper focus on what's truly happening within our workplace and learning environments. And the vision that I think we need to think about is really transforming into this equity-minded space, an equity-minded space that practices conscious inclusion. And so I'll quickly tell you a little bit what that means so you have a better understanding of it as well. So again, thinking about equity, and I'm not talking about health equity, I'm talking about equity, which is a much larger scale. The Association of American Colleges and Universities in 2015 began an incredible initiative called the Educational Equity Initiative for the students that they serve. And they basically wanted to say, you know, the reality is that we know that we have a dysfunctional educational system. And depending on your zip code and where you come from, really basically highlights about whether you are going to, if you look at the very far right side, there are some students that start at a much higher level as they're trying to attain the diplomas on top of this particular ladder because of where they come from. But we also have students that don't start at the time, they're a little bit lower, and ultimately have some of the benefits not on. And we certainly land. I'm going to go ahead and mute this because we're getting an echo. I hope that's better. But we also have students under that chart that basically are starting in underground essentially because of the zip code that they live in, the poorly funded schools, the teachers that they were exposed to as well. And so what we learned from the AACU is that thinking about equity, especially equity, an equity initiative, what does that mean? It just reframes the conversation. Student success from a mindset presently is focused on student deficits and limitations. The approaches that focus on student assets, the focus on the asset bundle that they bring to the table. It focuses on how successful institutions are, their responsibility and accountability for student success. So what does that mean? So if we look at the 5 principles that they brought up, basically it just really means that, again, we need to be evidence-based, of which we can all relate to, that it's a willingness to look at the student outcomes and their disparities at all educational levels that have been disaggregated by race and ethnicity, but as well as socioeconomic status as well. It's the recognition that students are not responsible for the unequal outcomes of their group that have historically experienced discrimination and marginalization in the United States as a result of a dysfunctional educational system that they came from. And it looks beyond the common stereotypes and the assumptions made by society and respects the aspirations and struggles of all of our students that have not been well served by our current educational system. It's the belief in fairness, that the reality is that we all start in different places and some of us have more needs than others, but it starts allocating those resources to the students that have the greatest need of respecting that. And finally, what it means to be equity-minded in an academic institution means that there's this recognition that there's entrenched biases, stereotypes, and discrimination within our institution. There's entrenched structural racism that has influenced our policies and practices. But being equity-minded means that we have a deliberate intent to begin addressing those entrenchments and basically making change to it as well. So the question I have is, can we, as medical educators, adopt this particular mindset of equity-mindedness and translate that into the work that we do? You know, I strongly believe that, number one, we have no choice. But I think this is the day of reckoning in which we can basically begin doing this on a regular basis and learn how. How? And this slide depicts it. You know, when you become an equity-minded, or I prefer the term equity-advancing leader or a medical educator, essentially we recognize that the persistent inequities that exist are the result of the social and structural inequities in our educational system. And we inherit that as the students come into our system as well in medical school. It's the understanding that we, as leaders and medical educators, have this obligation to begin addressing these inequities and the fallout that they have created, in our students, in our faculty, and subsequently our staff. Equity-minded leaders and medical educators are change agents, and they use this mindset to act for change. They're evidence-based, of which we all relate to because that's who we are. They're race-conscious. They're institutionally focused. They're system-based thinkers, and they're driven to advance equity. And again, can we adopt this, and how would we adopt this, and how we put it in place? Well, to take this a little bit further, again, what this means, and these are active steps that we could take, and that is, number one, I think, we need to be evidence-based because that's who we are, as I mentioned, but we need to be proactive and educate ourselves. We need to look at the data and really look at the social and historical context of structural oppression, experimentation, and exclusionary practices that have occurred in academic medicine throughout its whole history, and understand how that particular history has really impacted our new policies today and our processes, our traditional values that we hold and customs that we have. Now, how were they influenced and informed by structural racism and systemic racism over this amount of time? Now, how can we learn from our past wrongs and make reparation? We need to be more equity advancing. That just means, again, rejecting the ingrained habit of blaming inequities on the learner's own social, culture, and educational background. And it shifts this thought that what we need to really more focus on is not what they don't bring to the table. It's focus more on how do we leverage the assets that they bring to the table and lifting those up and not minimizing and not by their limitations. So it's not only just saying, well, they had an average MCAT score and a GPA, but it's actually looking at what are some other aptitudes and skill sets and characteristics and attributes that they bring to the table that's going to benefit society as when they become physicians, and how is it going to benefit our institution once we begin taking this paradigm as well. What race conscious really means is that essentially it's looking how structural racism has been embedded and how it influences higher education. How do we identify the subtle manifestations of systemic racism within our institutions and policies that we take for granted every day because we really don't think hard enough, but taking a very entrenched look at this and practice intentionality to critically deconstruct the structures, policies, and practices and embedded norms and values that are felt to be race neutral. And this is really not blame or shame. This is all about our ancestors have put many of these things into place. But I think today, with what's going on, we have an obligation to begin re-envisioning and re-looking at ourselves again to find out, what is it that we can possibly change that has been entrenched that we didn't really think about changing, but it is impacting us today. Being systemically aware means being a systems-based thinker, that in order for us to change any of these policies and practices, it is critical for us to think from a larger and a brighter scope of things. We have to think about how do we think transformatively in order to change our systems? How do we convene experts, not only within our healthcare industry, but outside of our industry that may add value and help us transform our mindsets in order to get to a whole new paradigm, moving away from a paradigm of sink or swim, publish or perish, screening out, more to an investment model that we see in the sense that we bring in these students, we bring in these faculty because of the talents and how they're going to make us better. Now, how do we lift them up so they not only just survive, but they thrive? If we switch our mindset, because if we switch it from a weeding out, screening out, which has the mindset of, I hope you survive with this, we're not going to invest in you, we're going to give you some resources, and it's really up to you to make that difference. It shifts that mindset to the institution taking hold of this and being accountable for their effectiveness. The AACU says, essentially, if one student fails, that means the institution has failed, and we've lost our effectiveness, so we have to be held accountable for that. Can you imagine if you think about that? It requires us to really shine a flashlight inward, look inside the mirror, so to speak, and it also requires an accountability system. It's going to take some risk, it's going to take some courage, it's going to take some political capital in order to begin doing a lot of this work. But I think we can do it as we mobilize the efforts from key stakeholders within, but also including our community members as well, who see us as an ivory tower, but are willing to be involved with us to help us make effective change, especially if they come from areas and that have already begun doing some of this work that we can learn a lot from. And so it really starts with asking the hard question, are inclusionary practices operating here? Or as Kamara Jones says, what are the manifestations of structural racism that are operating here? Time for us to begin looking at that, identifying that, and see where we can make systems change for them. So today I'm just bringing with you that I think the third dimension for us to achieve excellence is equity. And for a definition of what does it look like once we've achieved it, well, an equity advancing learning and workplace environment is achieved when every person in that organization, every person within that medical school, no matter if you're a staff member, a learner, a faculty member, is given that opportunity to attain their full potential, and no one is disadvantaged from achieving that potential because of their social position or group identity or another socially determined circumstance. When I think about opportunities, it is about health equity, but if you look in the wheel, it's about other things that we don't think about that we must think about. That's all inclusive with it. I'm not saying that health equity is not important. It is extremely important. But when I think about in terms of changing our environment, we need to focus on other things such as educational opportunities for everybody, salary equity, professional development, access to opportunities, access to advancement, and the list goes on and on along with that as well. So this is really about an intentional investment by organizations and everyone that works in or is part of this organizational community. And this also includes staff, because we forget staff as well. So again, that full potential we're talking about is really defined by our diversity that we bring to that table. It's our culture, it's our traditions, it's our beliefs, it's our lived experiences, and the intersectionality of the multiple identities that we bring to the table to define who we are, how we see the world, how we encounter each other, and how we make decisions. So when we learn this from Diversity 3.0 and it's showing you the benefits, that there's been a multitude of studies, that there's no question that this is good science, this is good for business, it's good for education, it's good for many other things that have been documented, saying, again, it cultivates a higher innovation mindset. Diversity catalyzes creativity. It also helps with complex problem solving and allows us to predict and forecast the future. But as diversity, one of my predecessors always says, diversity alone is not enough. What we know from studies is that essentially we learn that it has to be inextricably connected to inclusion, because without it, it's just tokenism. So in order to utilize all benefits, that inclusion plays a big role, because it's going to recognize the value of those differences, but also is set up to allow for those differences to be visible, to be expressed freely and safely and embraced, and more importantly, and validated as well. So there's been a lot of work from alone, essentially experts, that in order to have the benefits of the diversity be realized, when you hire a diverse employee, again, they basically also not only want to be hired, but in order to retain them, more integrated in the full social fabric and operation of the organization. So this really means to achieve inclusion. How do we create that infrastructure, policies, and practices? Is the existing perspectives, values it, but also leverages them as well. Allow people to reach their potential. The goal really is to ensure that people from all backgrounds are fully integrated and they're not excluded. They're fully engaged and they're not marginalized. And they're fully empowered and they're not diminished. What do studies tell us about the benefit if we do this? Well, from the business sector, this is what we found. And my hope is that AAMC tries to look at this and begin creating, measurements for the inclusive environment. I believe if we achieve this, we can achieve a lot. And what they found, starting from the top, is they found that those that practice inclusive excellence in their environment, in their workplace environment, they found that there's been an increase in the commitment and motivation by their employees, meaning translating to there's much more meaningful engagement. They feel like they belong and they feel like they contribute. That in turn, because of that, they maximizes their productivity. And also includes other things that they bring to the table. Many people at the table not with just a limited set of skill sets. A lot of them have been to other workplaces. A lot of them have been to other academic institutions. Sometimes they're never tapped. They're basically left in this particular box. And this is about Inclusive equity really taps all the talent that you have and not just what I hired you for. In turn, with increased engagement and increasing talent optimization, what they found there's a better sense of belonging. People are feeling much more valued, and they have a positive impact on job satisfaction. And that in turn, for them feeling much more utilized and validated, and a greater success at retention. When you have those four things, that leads to everybody's brand reputation, and everybody wants to come to Albany as an example, because I want to work in a place where everybody feels this and everybody attains this and everybody can achieve their full potential for that. What they have found is that even without any outreach, they have found that it attracts new talent and enhances diversity of the workforce. People want to work with you when they're in this part of this particular environment. And the last piece that they found is that surprising to them is that community was also paying attention and also felt that the relationships that they were building with their local communities as an anchor institution, that essentially they were enhanced. They found that the workforce became more representative of the community they served, and the trustworthiness, again, with the anchor institution actually increased. So I see this in the sense that maybe if we do this right, that all learners and employees are better engaged in the provision of patient care, maybe more productive because of their talent being utilized and lifted up, that they have a higher job satisfaction and less burnout. They feel better, that they're utilized, they feel validated for that, and they feel a sense of a belonging. And that translates into not only happy employees, but it translates into happier patients and enhanced trustworthiness. So where does an institution begin? What you see before you is just a summary of what we have created is called the foundational principles of inclusion and excellence. We found that people really enjoyed the concept of inclusion, but really didn't know what it looked like. And so we felt that as we step back, how could we create a model that ultimately would show these are the elements of an inclusive, excellent environment that practice both conscious inclusion and equity advancement. And just to run through those very briefly, it just basically means that ultimately is that you can achieve this particular vision through this practice of equityness and also conscious inclusion. And it starts with DEI as a strategic imperative, that the whole institution, the environment basically is pretty solid in understanding that people accept differences and they're valued and they're leveraged and they're very visible. But the intentionality of it is what's really critical. Authenticity and intersectionality allows a sense of belonging where you can belong, be part of this fundamental fabric. Because if I can truly be who I truly am, and I don't hide any of my identities, the intersectionality of those identities is what's going to create the highest level of innovation and creativity, honesty, better decision-making. You don't want employees, you don't want learners, you don't want staff, you don't want faculty only to bring part of themselves to the table, especially when they're trying to solve some complex institutions. But in order to have that, the most critical element of it is that I have to create that safe and civil environment in order for people to they can feel and share their voices openly. It's creating brave spaces, it's creating psychological safety. These all mean the same thing, but spaces where people feel that they will not be judged for being truly to who they are and bringing their lived experiences, their intelligence to the table that basically will help decision-making and other aspects of it as well. It's also approaching people with a dignity consciousness, and that just means it's a lot of work from Donna Hicks, who talked a lot about dignity. And dignity was basically this whole idea that we're born with dignity and nobody has the right to violate that dignity. We own it ourselves. But as we know, there's many elements that we face with mistreatment and harassment where our dignity is violated and taken away from us. But operating and treating each other with dignity consciousness basically not only respects each other, but it validates each other and values the contributions that we make. The equity advancement piece is really changing our mindset to the point that we move it towards an investment mindset instead of the paradigm of weeding out. It's identify those exclusionary practices that I've already talked about, that we look at it and we critically deconstruct those and address them, and we can move forward by providing equitable opportunities for professional and career development. And part of the most important element that we don't talk enough about is just developing a continuous equity improvement model. And that is simply said that we are all accountable, should be held accountable and responsible for diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, and it basically is part of our performance evaluation as well. So these are some of the things that the AAMC has done in order to kind of help, in order how to particular vision and how do you benefits. It first starts with not only creating that vision, but it also starts with assessing yourself, shining a flashlight around yourself, and really doing some true definitions. I like this part called it's called F5 for short, of the Foundational Principles, Inclusion, Excellence. In the wheel, you're going to see all the characteristics I just ran through in the summary. But we have developed a toolkit along with a workshop that details the description of each of these 9 principles. And it's accompanied by an assessment survey tool that really measures the lives of people under 9 things as well. So a scorecard that tells you where are you practicing? Are you practicing excellence? Or how much work do you need to do in order to move that needle to get to excellence? It also has a compilation, 20 pages compilation of best practices that we have identified across all medical schools of people doing the work already, along with a resource guide, readings, people to contact in order to get better ideas with it as well. We just finished completing a pilot for a self-administrative model instead of us having to do a workshop with a facilitator's guide and a toolkit that has slides and some other means and some of the tests, that sort of thing, that we'd be happy. And this is great for department level, division levels, or unit levels to basically use this particular model to do the measurement. Then we have some stronger things that basically are going to take a more in-depth dive that are at the institutional level. We have a diversity engagement survey some of you know about. We have a new model coming out in the fall called the Diversity, Inclusion, Culture, Equity Inventory. So basically it's more related to what policies and things do you have in place with human capital, what structure, financial-wise do you have, what governance and have in order to move towards a more inclusive climate as well. And then certainly we have a standpoint survey that looks at faculty and staff lived experience as well. But also we have models that are coming out with addressing some of the problems and challenges that I've already mentioned, such as addressing mistreatment, harassment, and racism. Not going to go into detail because you can find it on the website, but we've created trainings in unconscious bias and questions. We have a new model out called Restorative Justice for Academic Medicine, where we are providing training to a trainer for certified facilitators who can actually run this. And then last but not least, a bystander prevention and intervention training. By the end of the month, we're going to be coming out with a framework to address racism in academic medicine as well that we're excited to get out. That's why it's a parentheses. There's some other models that, again, we've partnered with UVA that have some modules in order to use for training and things. I'm just going to end really quickly by talking about a new gender equity innovation lab that we have addressing the sexual and gender harassment. We have a group that's working on providing resources, effective practices and toolkits on how to basically reach equity as well. And we have a lot of work where us and 2 other associations got together to create this to begin addressing gender harassment in STEM. So I'll end with this, is that I think where we are now is ultimately is that, I believe like we are in society, that we're really facing this cultural divide in academic medicine, and it's time for us really to think about, how do we cross that cultural divide? How do we bridge it? And I think it's going to require us to be intentional about crossing that cultural divide, and not alone, but together. A willingness to face our vulnerabilities and explore new ways of thinking. How we expand our new worldview is going to be really a critical space. So can you imagine, what's possible if we cross that bridge? Focusing on the importance of inclusion excellence and the role that it plays in creating the foundation that's necessary to really overcome some of the challenges and exclusionary practices that we talked about today, that may be in place at your academic institution, that inhibit really all of us from achieving diversity and leveraging its bonuses. You reimagine what it would be like if we can become equity advancing and practice conscious inclusion. We have to do this with intentionality, without a doubt, and we have to get the commitment in order to reach it. Because again, at the very end of this, the important piece about it is then we can emerge as an equity advancing institution where academic health centers is recognized as a place where everybody has the opportunity to achieve their full potential. It's going to require that transformative thinking where we consciously change one's frame of reference in order to come to new understandings and influence of behavior. There's my summary slide. If you forgot everything that I've talked to you about, I want you to walk home with this graphic, and that is, I really see this as the third dimension. The diversity and inclusion and excellence are means to emerge as an equity advancing academic health science center. And once you've achieved the third dimension, equity, I think that's when we finally achieve excellence. We have each of these three domains in place. Thank you for listening. Appreciate you being here today as well.
Thank you so much for all of your insight, Dr. Acosta. I think we do have enough time for a question or two. It looks like Dr. Collick did submit something, and I invite, if anyone else has a question, to go ahead and throw it in the chat if we have time. But she said that she appreciates your further explanation of the very real, frustrating entity of minority tax, but would like you to further explain code switching.
Code switching basically is, code switching is just simply that you can't be authentic to who you are, and what you end up doing is the identity that you have, you pretend to be something that you're not in order for you to fit in and not to be called out. Because of that vulnerable space, ultimately, I have to begin assimilating or acculturating to a particular culture along with that. So if I'm a Latino that basically is there and I have, I'm in a lab or I'm in a faculty meeting where I'm the only person of color in that room, I have a choice to make whether I am going to basically stand up for who I really am and reveal that. But if I'm fearful of how that's going to impact my career, how that's going to impact, I'm going to be judged or I may get retaliated, I may just adapt to how the group think is happening at that point. And that way I rob myself because I can't be authentic to who I am, and I can't be my real self to the table.
Thank you. It looks like Dr. Stain asked, how successful have medical schools been in adopting a policy of not blaming learners for outcomes? How does one start down that path?
No, I think it's a great conversation. I think, we haven't begun to achieve it in medical education yet. I've probably been now at visited 55, 56 medical campuses before the COVID pandemic. Again, providing the talk as well. It's been very well received, but are starting to put things in place. So I don't think we're there yet. But again, we also are very much aware of the resistance that we'll have because it's a paradigm shift for everybody. But I think it's what's really important about any time that you hit resistance is, the work that the skill sets that people need is know how to run towards resistance, not away from it. But also give people those that are resistant voice to really figure out, why are you resistant towards this? What is it that is preventing you from having some transformative thinking? What's blocking it? What experiences that you've had? What triggers you? Because it starts with that dialogue. And not everybody knows how to have that dialogue, but I think, again, we're a smart intellectual group that we know how to get training in certain things. And if we can't dialogue openly and straight up to get past our resistances, then it's time to bring in, somebody with content expertise who can basically teach us and train us and coach us how to begin having some of these dialogues as well. We have a tradition that's been embedded in our system for a long, long time, right? I like this notion of institution, being responsible for their effectiveness, right? Because it really changes the paradigm in the sense that, it's this concept that nobody will fail. We know that there are external factors that impact learners along the way. A lot of it's family. I think about the pandemic itself. Pandemic has impacted our learners, especially if you come from a vulnerable community and you've been expected by your family to come home and take care of your family because of the illnesses that they've had. And to them, medical school will always be there, but not your family. And again, I think part of it is really having other people to understand other people's cultures and backgrounds, and that they may believe in something totally different than how you were raised. But it's being sensitized to that and using what we call culture humility, to being very open to the perspective of others, and not pretending that we know and we can assume, why people may not be showing up to class. Ultimately, we really want to find out more and not rely on our own assumptions for that. That's how you get away from starting to blame the learners and moving towards this, and that's just, what's that resistance?
Okay, and it looks like we'll have one more question, and that's from Pamela Young. what would be your recommendation for anyone experiencing or witnessing bias? That is a provider saying something about a patient's hair or name, and how do you overcome fear of being penalized and seen as the minority?
Yeah. No, I think, one of the things that I think that I've seen very helpful is, again, two things really. It's about training and understanding implicit bias is a start. But I only look at implicit bias doing one thing. It teaches you how to reflect on your own stereotypes, your own biases you have, both conscious and unconscious biases you have, but more important, the assumptions that you have. Why do you have certain triggers when you're up against a certain situation? And it really helps you to reflect on that. But it also, unconscious bias training helps you pause, stop the internal dialogue, and really understand and listen to the perspective of others and appreciate. Doesn't mean when you listen and you appreciate that, doesn't mean that you agree with them. It just means you respect them as a human being, but you understand they see the world much differently than you do. But that's what basically I think has helped. Number two, I think the one that I've seen that's really kind of coming into vogue, that is having a lot more in combination with implicit bias training, is upstander prevention intervention training. And we learned a lot of this from sexual and gender harassment, that essentially is that we as witnesses, as we witness, frank macroaggressions, or we witness frank and egregious racial discrimination, those are easy to see, but it's the subtle manifestations in which if we give collective voice to stop and call out bigoted comments, discriminatory comments, biased comments as well, then we see the business industry has already taught us this. We will see a change in the perpetrators and the offenders of that as well. But it takes a community. It doesn't take just one. I love the notion of what prevention intervention means, that you train everybody, not just one individual or trainers. You're training everybody from the staff to students to faculty, even our leadership, in order to do that. And last, I would say the people that are doing really good work on this have these bias response teams, so that when you feel that you are a victim of this, there are people been trained to really know how to help those and curtail those particular things, but also how to bring it to others, that make decisions in the institution to make that effective change. Because if there's a violation of policies and processes, that needs to be called out. And that's where those bias response teams really help out quite a bit.
Great, thanks so much. That about wraps it up for today, or for this talk. LMSA, or on behalf of LMSA, we would like to give special thanks to Dr. David Acosta, our inaugural Latinx Heritage Month Grand Rounds Speaker here at AMC. We'd also like to thank Dr. Cosgrove, the Vice Dean of Academic Administration, and the Julio Sosa Chair of Medical Education. We'd also like to give our thanks to our LMSA faculty advisors, Dr. Jorge Ortiz and Dr. Hyacinth Mason, as well as to Asinia Crawford at the AAMC for their support. Also, thank you all of our LMSA Executive Board, all of our members, Kathleen Whipple, Lauren Hartman, and all of our co-sponsors, including the Department of Medical Education, the Department of Family Med and Community Medicine, and the Division of Community Outreach and Medical Education. And lastly, thank you to all of you who have attended. We invite you to join us again on October 6th at noon for another Latinx Heritage Month Grand Rounds featuring Dr. Brenda Pareda, Assistant Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the University of New Mexico. And she will be speaking on a presentation titled Race, Racism, and Health. Thank you all again, and we hope to see you all soon.
Thank you.